rancher carried a wounded tribal girl on his horse. The next day, he woke up tied to a tree. The rope bit deep into Caleb's wrists, rough hemp fibers drawing blood as he strained against the oak tree. Morning sun filtered through dense leaves above, casting dancing shadows across his face while his horse grazed peacefully 30 yards away, completely indifferent to his predicament. His head throbbed with each heartbeat, memories of the previous day floating back like fragments of a half-remembered dream. 24 hours earlier, everything had seemed normal. Caleb Morrison had been riding fence line on the eastern boundary of his ranch, checking for breaks where cattle might wander into Apache territory. At 30 years old, he had learned to read the land like scripture, understanding every ridge and gulch across his 2,000 acres of Montana grassland. The October air carried the promise of an early winter, with aspen leaves already turning golden against the backdrop of snow-capped mountains. His bay stallion Ranger picked his way carefully along the rocky trail that wound through scattered ponderosa pines. Caleb had been thinking about the upcoming cattle drive to Billings when he first spotted the smoke rising from a hidden valley below. Thin wisps curled upward against the clear blue sky, too controlled to be a wildfire but too isolated to be from any homestead he knew about. Curiosity overrode caution. He urged Ranger down the steep embankment, following an old game trail that switched back through dense undergrowth. The smell hit him first, acrid smoke mixed with something else, something that made his stomach clench. As they emerged into the valley floor, the scene unfolded like a nightmare painted in broad daylight. 3 wagons burned in the center of a small clearing, their canvas covers consumed by hungry flames that reached toward the sky. Bodies lay scattered around the campsite, some face down in the dirt, others twisted at impossible angles. Caleb dismounted slowly, his hand instinctively moving to the Colt revolver at his hip. The attack appeared recent. Smoke still billowed from the wagon frames, and the ground remained soft with fresh blood. He moved through the carnage with practiced caution, checking each fallen figure for signs of life. These had been travelers, probably a family heading west like so many others seeking fortune in the gold fields of California. Their possessions lay strewn across the campsite, a child's wooden doll with yarn hair, a Bible with pages fluttering in the breeze, a photograph of a stern-faced man in Sunday clothes. A soft moan froze him in his tracks. Behind the largest wagon, partially hidden beneath a blood-stained blanket, someone moved. Caleb approached carefully, his boots crunching on broken glass from a shattered lantern. When he pulled back the blanket, he found her. She could not have been older than 20, with long black hair braided with beads and feathers that marked her as Apache. Blood seeped from a deep gash along her left shoulder, and her buckskin dress was torn and stained. Her dark eyes opened as he knelt beside her, revealing a mixture of pain and defiance that caught him off guard. Most men would have walked away. Apache raids on settlers had increased over the past year, and tensions ran high between the tribal communities and white homesteaders. Finding an Apache woman at the site of what appeared to be a massacre would normally mean only one thing to most folks, but something in her eyes stopped him cold. She tried to sit up, wincing as the movement opened her wound further. Blood flowed more freely, soaking into the earth beneath her. Without conscious thought, Caleb found himself reaching for his canteen and the clean bandana from his saddlebag. She spoke in rapid Apache, words he could not understand but whose meaning seemed clear enough. She expected him to finish what others had started. Instead, he gently pushed her back down and began cleaning the wound with water from his canteen. The gash was deep but clean, probably from a knife rather than a bullet. With careful hands, he wrapped his bandana around her shoulder, applying pressure to slow the bleeding. Her eyes never left his face as he worked, studying him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. When he finished the makeshift bandage, she attempted to stand again, clearly intending to leave despite her weakened condition. Caleb caught her arm as she swayed dangerously. She was losing too much blood, and the nearest town lay 2 days' ride through hostile territory. Even if she could walk, which seemed unlikely, night would bring predators both animal and human. The smart thing would have been to leave her with his spare water and some jerky, then ride for help. The safe thing would have been to assume she was responsible for the massacre and turn her over to the authorities. The expected thing would have been to view her as a threat to his own survival. Instead, he found himself lifting her carefully onto Ranger's back. She was lighter than he expected, her body trembling with shock and blood loss as he settled her in front of his saddle. She leaned back against his chest, her head falling onto his shoulder as consciousness faded in and out. The ride to his ranch would take 3 hours at a careful pace, long enough for infection to set in if her wound was not properly treated. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks when they finally reached his homestead. The ranch sat in a natural bowl surrounded by rolling hills, with a 2-story log house, a large barn, and several outbuildings scattered across the property. His cattle grazed peacefully in distant pastures, unaware of the drama unfolding in their midst. Caleb carried her into the house, laying her gently on the leather sofa in his front room. She drifted in and out of consciousness as he cleaned and properly dressed her. Wound with supplies from the medicine chest his late wife had insisted on keeping well stocked. The bullet had passed clean through the fleshy part of her shoulder without hitting bone or major. Blood vessels painful but not life-threatening if kept clean. As evening settled over the ranch, he prepared a simple meal of beans and cornbread, unsure if she would be able to eat but knowing she needed sustenance to recover her strength. She woke as he set a plate on the small table beside the sofa, her dark eyes immediately scanning the room for threats or escape routes. He moved slowly, keeping his hands visible as he pulled up a chair several feet away. The last thing he wanted was to startle an injured person who had obviously been through tremendous trauma. She spoke again in Apache, her voice stronger now but still wary. When he shook his head to indicate he did not understand, she switched to heavily accented English. "Why you help me?" Her words carried suspicion mixed with genuine curiosity. Caleb considered the question seriously before answering. He could have said it was the Christian thing to do, or that he would have helped anyone in her condition. Both would have been true but incomplete. "Seemed like the right thing," he said finally, his voice quiet in the lamplight. "You were hurt, and I had the means to help." She studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to read his true intentions behind the simple words. Outside, wind rattled the windows while his cattle settled in for the night, their occasional lowing carrying across the darkened pastures. "My people did not do this thing," she said suddenly, gesturing toward her wounded shoulder. "White men with painted faces. They wanted to look like Apache work." The implications of her words hit him like a physical blow. False flag attacks designed to inflame tensions between settlers and tribal communities were not unheard of, though proving such claims was nearly impossible. Men seeking to profit from conflict had been known to stage raids, leaving Apache arrows or other tribal artifacts to implicate innocent communities. "You saw who did this?" She nodded slowly. 3 men. One had yellow hair and a scar here. She touched her left cheek. "They killed the family, then saw me watching from the trees. I ran, but not fast enough." Caleb felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October evening. If her account was accurate, then somewhere in the territory, 3 murderers were counting on racial prejudice to cover their tracks. By tomorrow, word of the massacre would spread, and Apache communities would face retaliation for crimes they had not committed. She must have sensed his thoughts because she continued speaking, her voice growing stronger despite her obvious exhaustion. "My name is Ayanna. I was gathering herbs when the attack happened. My people camped 2 days north, but I cannot return like this. They will think I led the killers to the family." The complexity of her situation became clearer with each revelation. Not only was she wounded and far from home, but returning to her own community might put her in as much danger as staying among white settlers. Accusations of collaboration with enemies could be as deadly as the original attack. Caleb found himself in an impossible position. Harboring an Apache woman on his ranch would invite suspicion from neighbors who already questioned his refusal to join the local militia. Yet turning her out in her current condition would essentially be signing her death warrant. As if reading his internal struggle, Ayanna attempted to rise from the sofa. The effort cost her, and fresh blood seeped through the clean bandages on her shoulder. She was in no condition to travel, regardless of the political complications her presence might create. "You stay put," Caleb said firmly, gently pushing her back down. "That wound needs time to heal, and you need rest." She looked at him with something approaching surprise, as if kindness from a white rancher was the last thing she had expected to encounter. "You risk much," she said quietly. "Your neighbors will not understand." "My neighbors don't run this ranch," he replied, though they both knew the situation was far more complicated than his words suggested. The evening passed quietly, with Caleb checking her bandages and ensuring she drank plenty of water to replace what she had lost. As midnight approached, exhaustion finally overcame her weariness, and she fell into a deep sleep on the sofa. Caleb sat in his kitchen long into the night, wrestling with the implications of his decision. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, he had done what his conscience demanded. Outside, coyotes called to each other across the darkened hills, their voices carrying on the wind like warnings of troubles yet to come. He finally retired to his bedroom just before dawn, setting his boots beside the door and hanging his gun belt on the bedpost within easy reach. Sleep came fitfully, filled with dreams of burning wagons and painted faces he could not quite see clearly. When consciousness returned, sunlight was streaming through his bedroom window, and birds were singing in the oak tree outside. For a moment, he lay still, trying to shake off the lingering fragments of troubled dreams. Then reality rushed back with crystalline clarity. He was tied to a tree, and Ayanna was nowhere to be seen. The ropes around his wrists were expertly knotted, tight enough to prevent escape but not so tight as to cut off circulation entirely. His boots had been removed, though his clothes remained untouched. Most tellingly, his gun belt hung from a branch several feet away, clearly visible but completely out of reach. Morning air carried the scent of pine needles and dew-damp earth. Somewhere nearby, a stream gurgled over stones, and his cattle continued their eternal grazing as if nothing unusual had happened. The normalcy of it all made his situation seem even more surreal. Footsteps approached through the undergrowth, measured and deliberate. Ayanna emerged from behind a cluster of serviceberry bushes, moving with surprising grace for someone who had been bleeding and unconscious less than 12 hours earlier. She carried his rifle in one hand and a small leather pouch in the other. Her shoulder was still bandaged, but she moved without obvious pain or limitation. Either she was tougher than he had imagined, or adrenaline was masking her discomfort. Her dark eyes held none of the vulnerability or gratitude he might have expected from someone whose life he had saved. "Good morning, Caleb Morrison," she said, settling herself on a fallen log about 10 feet away. The fact that she knew his full name was unsettling, since he had never introduced himself. "Morning," he replied carefully, testing the strength of his bonds without being obvious about it. The ropes held firm. "Mind if I ask what this is about?" Ayanna opened the leather pouch and withdrew several items: jerky, a small knife, and what appeared to be medicinal herbs. She began eating the jerky with deliberate slowness, studying his face as if memorizing every detail. "You helped me yesterday," she said between bites. "That was unexpected. So you tied me to a tree? Interesting way of saying thank you." A smile played at the corners of her mouth, the first genuine expression of humor he had seen from her. It transformed her face completely, revealing a personality that had been hidden beneath layers of pain and suspicion. "I needed to be sure of your intentions," she said. "Men who help Apache women usually want something in return." The implication hung between them like smoke from a campfire, heavy, unavoidable, and potentially dangerous. Caleb understood her caution even as he chafed against the restraints that held him captive. "And what did you decide?" She considered the question while finishing her meal, taking her time as if his fate depended on her deliberation. Which, he realized, it probably did. "You sleep like a dead man," she said finally. Very trusting for someone harboring an enemy. "You're not my enemy. Your neighbors would disagree." She had a point. The political situation between white settlers and Apache communities had deteriorated significantly over the past year, driven by a combination of legitimate grievances and deliberate provocation from parties unknown. Trust was a luxury few could afford, and compassion was often viewed as weakness or collaboration. Ayanna stood and walked closer, stopping just out of his reach. Her movements were fluid and confident, suggesting that her injury was either healing remarkably quickly or causing less impairment than it appeared. She knelt beside him, close enough that he could smell the sage and sweetgrass in her hair. "The men who killed that family," she said quietly, "they will do it again. And again, until your people and mine are at war. Then help me stop them." The words surprised him as much as they seemed to surprise her. He had not consciously planned to make such an offer, but once spoken, it felt right. Justice for the murdered family required more than good intentions and wishful thinking. Ayanna's eyes narrowed as she studied his face, searching for signs of deception or ulterior motive. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied some internal test, because she reached behind the tree and produced his knife. "Very well, Caleb Morrison," she said, beginning to cut through the ropes around his wrists. "But we do this my way." As the bonds fell away, Caleb rubbed circulation back into his hands and tried to process the sudden shift in their dynamic. 24 hours ago, he had been a solitary rancher living a quiet life on the Montana frontier. Now he found himself partnered with an Apache woman in what amounted to a private investigation that could easily get them both killed. "What exactly is your way?" he asked, retrieving his boots and gun belt. Ayanna was already moving toward his horse, her manner suggesting that lengthy discussions were not part of her methodology. She swung up onto Ranger's back with practiced ease, settling herself behind the saddle as if she belonged there. "We find the men with painted faces," she said simply, "and we make them pay for what they have done." The morning sun climbed higher over the Montana hills as Caleb mounted his horse, acutely aware that his life had just taken a dramatic and potentially dangerous turn. Behind him, his ranch lay peaceful and secure, a symbol of everything he had worked to build over the past decade. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and the slim possibility of justice for a family whose names he would never know. But as they rode out together into the vast wilderness, he found himself oddly optimistic about their chances. Ayanna might be an enigma wrapped in contradictions, but she was also clearly someone who got things done. The hunt was about to begin. They rode in silence for the first hour, following a winding trail that led deeper into the wilderness. Ayanna guided them with subtle shifts of her weight, indicating direction without words. Her knowledge of the terrain was impressive. She seemed to know every game trail, every hidden water source, every vantage point that offered a clear view of the surrounding country. The landscape gradually changed as they moved north and east. Rolling grasslands gave way to broken country filled with rocky outcroppings, dense stands of timber, and steep-sided canyons that could hide an army. It was perfect country for ambush, and Caleb found himself checking their back trail more frequently as the morning wore on. Around midday, Ayanna signaled for them to stop beside a small creek that tumbled down from the mountains above. The water was crystal clear and ice-cold, fed by snowmelt from peaks that remained white year-round. They dismounted and let Ranger drink his fill while they rested in the shade of a massive cottonwood tree. Caleb studied his companion as she knelt by the stream, cupping water in her hands to drink. Her movements were economical and purposeful, betraying none of the weakness he would have expected from someone with a serious shoulder wound. Either she was exceptionally tough, or she was hiding her pain better than most men he knew. "How's your shoulder?" he asked, breaking the silence that had stretched between them since leaving his ranch. She glanced at him over her shoulder, water droplets still clinging to her lips. "It will heal." "That's not what I asked." A slight smile played at the corners of her mouth. "No, it is not." She stood and walked to where he sat against the tree trunk, moving with that same fluid grace he had noticed earlier. Without warning, she began unwrapping the bandage on her shoulder, revealing the wound he had cleaned and dressed the night before. The gash was angry and red around the edges, but there were no signs of infection. The bleeding had stopped completely, and the wound appeared to be closing faster than should have been possible. Either she possessed remarkable healing abilities, or his medical skills were better than he had given himself credit for. "You did good work," she said, rewrapping the bandage with practiced efficiency. "My grandmother taught me about healing plants. I gathered some this morning while you slept." That explained her improved condition, though it raised new questions about how long she had been awake and moving around while he remained unconscious. The thought that she could have killed him in his sleep but chose not to was both reassuring and unsettling. "Tell me about these men with painted faces," Caleb said, changing the subject to more immediate concerns. Ayanna settled herself on a flat rock nearby, close enough for conversation but maintaining the careful distance she seemed to prefer. Her dark eyes grew distant as she recalled the events of the previous day. "I was gathering wild onions in the valley when I heard the first screams," she began, her voice taking on the rhythmic cadence of someone accustomed to oral storytelling. The family had been camped there for 2 days, resting their oxen before the climb over Blackfoot Pass. She paused to check their surroundings, a habit that spoke of someone who had learned not to let her guard down even in seemingly safe places. Satisfied that they remained alone, she continued. 3 men came from the east, riding hard. They wore war paint like my people, but the patterns were wrong. Apache warriors paint for spiritual protection, not for show. These men painted to deceive. The implications were clear, but Caleb wanted to hear her complete account before drawing his own conclusions. False flag operations were not uncommon on the frontier, where racial tensions could be manipulated for profit or political gain. The leader had yellow hair and a scar that ran from his left eye to his jaw. He carried a rifle with silver decorations on the stock. The second man was shorter, with dark hair and a missing finger on his right hand. The third rode a paint horse with distinctive white markings on its face. Her attention to detail was remarkable, especially considering that she had been witnessing a massacre while hiding in fear for her own life. Such observations could prove invaluable if they managed to track down the killers. "They took nothing from the wagons," she continued. "No money, no supplies, nothing of value. They scattered Apache arrows around the bodies and left a war lance stuck in the ground beside the largest wagon. Then they set everything on fire and rode away laughing." The picture that emerged was one of calculated brutality designed to achieve maximum political impact. The murdered family was secondary to the larger goal of inciting warfare between white settlers and Apache communities. Such conflicts inevitably benefited certain parties' land speculators, military contractors, politicians seeking to justify expanded federal intervention. "Did you recognize any of them?" Caleb asked. Ayanna shook her head. "Not Apache, not soldiers, not settlers I have seen before. But the yellow-haired man wore a badge beneath his shirt. I saw it glint in the sunlight when he leaned over one of the bodies. A badge changed everything. If one of the killers was a law enforcement officer, then the conspiracy reached higher than simple criminal opportunism. Sheriff's deputies, federal marshals, even military officers had been known to exceed their authority when monetary or political incentives aligned with their personal interests. "We need to get back to that valley," Caleb said, already calculating the time required to reach the massacre site and conduct a thorough investigation. "Already done," Ayanna replied, producing a small leather pouch from inside her dress. I returned there before dawn while you slept. She opened the pouch and carefully removed several items, a brass button engraved with an eagle, a piece of torn fabric that appeared to be from a military uniform, and a distinctive horseshoe with an unusual wear pattern. The button was caught on a thorn bush near where they mounted their horses, she explained. The fabric was stuck to the war lance they left behind. The horseshoe came from the paint horse I found where they waited in the trees before attacking. Caleb examined each piece of evidence carefully. The button was standard military issue, but the fabric appeared to be from a civilian shirt rather than a uniform. The horseshoe bore the mark of a particular blacksmith, though he would need to consult with someone more knowledgeable to identify its origin. You've been busy, he said, returning the items to her pouch. My people do not survive by hoping others will seek justice for us, she replied matter-of-factly. We learn to rely on ourselves. Her pragmatic approach to their investigation was both impressive and sobering. While he had been sleeping peacefully in his own bed, she had been conducting a detailed crime scene analysis despite her injury and the obvious danger of returning to the site. They remounted and continued their journey, following a series of interconnected trails that seemed to lead nowhere in particular. Ayanna's navigation was intuitive rather than systematic. She read the landscape like a book written in a language only she understood. As the afternoon wore on, the terrain became increasingly challenging. They climbed steep slopes covered in loose shale that threatened to send rangers sliding back down with every step. Dense forests of lodgepole pine blocked out most of the sunlight, creating a twilight atmosphere even at midday. Where exactly are we going? Caleb asked during one of their frequent stops to rest the horse. To see someone who might know about men with painted faces and military buttons, Ayanna replied cryptically. Her reluctance to provide specific details was beginning to wear on his patience, but he recognized that trust was something that had to be earned gradually. Given the volatile political situation and her own precarious position between two potentially hostile communities, her caution was understandable if inconvenient. They emerged from the forest onto a high plateau that offered spectacular views of the surrounding country. Mountain peaks stretched to the horizon in every direction, their snow-covered summits gleaming like jewels in the afternoon sunlight. Far below, rivers wound through valleys green with late-season grass. Ayanna dismounted and led them to the edge of a precipice that dropped away into a canyon so deep its bottom was lost in shadow. The view was breathtaking, but Caleb found himself wondering about the tactical implications of their position. They were completely exposed on the plateau, visible for miles in every direction. Beautiful country, he commented, dismounting to stand beside her. My grandmother used to bring me here when I was small, she said, her voice softening with memory. She taught me to read the signs that white men cannot see. What kind of signs? Ayanna pointed to a distant ridge where a thin column of smoke rose straight up in the still air. To Caleb, it looked like a simple campfire, but her expression suggested something more significant. 3 fires, spaced equal distance apart, she said. Someone is sending a message. He studied the smoke more carefully and realized she was correct. What he had initially perceived as a single fire was actually 3 separate columns rising from different points along the ridge. The spacing was too regular to be coincidental. What does it mean? Strangers in Apache territory, she translated. Armed and dangerous. The implication was clear. They were being watched, and their presence had been communicated to others. Whether those others were friendly or hostile remained to be seen, but Caleb found himself checking his weapons and scanning the surrounding terrain for potential ambush sites. Friends of yours? He asked. Perhaps, she replied, but her tone suggested uncertainty rather than confidence. They remounted and began descending into the canyon via a trail so narrow that rangers' hooves sent stones clattering into the abyss below. The path switchbacked repeatedly, following ancient game routes that had been used by countless generations of animals and humans. As they descended, the temperature rose noticeably. The canyon walls provided shelter from the wind but also trapped heat like a natural oven. By the time they reached the bottom, both horse and riders were covered in sweat despite the cool October air above. A stream ran along the canyon floor, its banks lined with willows and wild roses that created an oasis-like atmosphere in the midst of the stark landscape. The sound of running water was soothing after hours of wind and silence, but Caleb noticed that Ayana remained alert and watchful. "We walk from here," she announced, dismounting and beginning to remove Ranger's saddle. "How much further?" "Not far, but horses cannot go where we need to go." She led them to a grove of aspens where Ranger could graze and drink while they continued on foot. The trees provided good cover and multiple escape routes if the horse needed to flee danger. Her choice of location revealed a strategic mind that thought several moves ahead. They followed the stream deeper into the canyon, walking single file along a path that seemed to disappear and reappear at random intervals. Rock formations rose around them like ancient cathedrals, carved by millennia of wind and water into fantastic shapes that seemed almost supernatural in the filtered sunlight. After nearly an hour of walking, they rounded a bend in the stream and found themselves facing a wall of red sandstone that appeared to block further progress. Ayana approached the wall and began running her hands along its surface, searching for something that was not immediately obvious. "Here," she said, finding what appeared to be a simple crack in the rock. She squeezed sideways through the opening, which was barely wide enough for a person to pass. Caleb followed, scraping his shoulders against the rough stone as he forced himself through the narrow passage. On the other side lay a hidden valley completely enclosed by towering canyon walls. A small lake reflected the sky like a mirror, fed by a waterfall that cascaded down from invisible heights above. The grass was green and thick, dotted with wildflowers that should have died with the first frost but somehow continued to thrive in this sheltered microclimate. In the center of the valley sat a small cabin built from local stone and timber. Smoke rose from its chimney, and a garden filled with vegetables and medicinal plants occupied a sunny spot beside the front door. It was like discovering a secret world hidden away from the harsh realities of frontier life. "Welcome to my grandmother's home," Ayana said, her voice filled with affection and pride. An elderly woman emerged from the cabin as they approached, moving with the measured pace of someone who had learned not to waste energy on unnecessary haste. Her hair was completely white and braided with beads and feathers and patterns that spoke of significant status within her community. Her dark eyes were bright with intelligence and humor, taking in every detail of their unexpected arrival. She spoke rapidly in Apache, her words directed at Ayana but her gaze fixed on Caleb with undisguised curiosity. The conversation continued for several minutes, with Ayana occasionally gesturing toward him or touching her wounded shoulder. Finally, the old woman approached him directly, studying his face with the intensity of someone reading a map of unfamiliar territory. When she spoke, her English was clear and precise, though heavily accented. "My granddaughter tells me you saved her life," she said without preamble. "This is not something I would have expected from a white rancher." "I did what anyone should have done," Caleb replied, unsure of the appropriate protocol for such conversations. The old woman's laugh was rich and genuine. "You did what you chose to do, not what anyone would do. There is a difference." She gestured for them to follow her into the cabin, which proved to be larger and more comfortable than its external appearance suggested. The single room was divided into functional areas, a cooking space with a wood-burning stove, a sleeping area with beds covered in beautiful woven blankets, and a work area where herbs hung drying from the rafters. "Sit," she commanded, indicating a wooden table that dominated the center of the room. "You will eat, and then we will discuss these men with painted faces who bring shame to my people." As she bustled around preparing food, Caleb found himself wondering how much Ayanna had told her grandmother about their mission. The old woman's matter-of-fact reference to the killer suggested that she already knew more about the situation than he would have expected. The meal was simple but delicious venison stew seasoned with wild herbs, cornbread baked in a Dutch oven, and tea brewed from plants he could not identify but found surprisingly refreshing. They ate in comfortable silence while the grandmother studied both of them with calculating eyes. "My name is Nasha," she said finally, clearing away the empty bowls. "I am what your people would call a medicine woman, though that term does not adequately describe my responsibilities to my community." She returned to the table carrying a leather pouch similar to the one Ayanna had produced earlier. From it, she withdrew the brass button, the torn fabric, and the horseshoe that had been collected from the massacre site. "These tell a story," she said, arranging the items in a precise pattern on the table. "But not the story you might expect." Caleb leaned forward, eager to hear her interpretation of the evidence they had gathered. Nasha's knowledge of both Apache and white cultures could provide insights that neither he nor Ayanna possessed individually. "The button is from a cavalry uniform, but old maybe 10 years or more," she began, handling each item as she spoke. "The fabric is newer, from a shirt made in the East. Expensive material, not something a common soldier would wear." She held up the horseshoe, turning it so the light revealed the distinctive wear pattern Ayanna had noticed. "This horse carries extra weight on its right side. The rider is missing his left leg below the knee, probably from a war wound. He uses a wooden leg that changes how he sits in the saddle." Her analysis was remarkably detailed, turning simple physical evidence into a profile of one of their quarry. Caleb found himself impressed by her deductive abilities and wondering what other skills she possessed. "The paint horse with the white markings," she continued, "belongs to a man named Garrett Wells. He operates a freight business between Fort Benton and the mining camps in the Judith Mountains. I have seen him here many times over the years." Finally, they had a name and a specific location to investigate. The transformation of their hunt from a needle-in-a-haystack search to a focused investigation gave Caleb hope that justice might actually be possible. "Where would we find this Garrett Wells?" he asked. Nasha smiled grimly. "That depends on whether he knows you are looking for him." Nasha's cryptic words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. The old woman's eyes held secrets accumulated over decades of watching the interplay between Apache and white communities, understanding patterns that remained invisible to those caught up in the immediate drama of frontier life. "Garrett Wells is not a man who runs from trouble," she continued, settling into her chair with the deliberate movements of someone whose body had endured countless hardships. "He faces it head-on, usually with a gun in his hand and anger in his heart." The late afternoon sun slanted through the cabin's single window, casting long shadows across the wooden table where the evidence lay arranged like pieces of an incomplete puzzle. Caleb studied the items again, trying to see beyond their physical properties to the story they told about the men who had left them behind. "Tell us about Wells," he said, recognizing that information would be their most valuable weapon in the confrontation that lay ahead. Nasha reached for a clay pipe on the mantelpiece, filling it with tobacco mixed with aromatic herbs before lighting it with a burning twig from the fireplace. The ritual seemed to help her organize her thoughts, preparing for what was clearly going to be a lengthy recounting. "Garrett Wells came to Montana Territory 15 years ago," she began, exhaling fragrant smoke toward the ceiling. "A Confederate veteran looking to start fresh after the war ended badly for his side. He had money more than a discharged soldier should have possessed, and he used it to establish his freight operation." She paused to tend the fire, adding another log to the flames that provided both light and warmth against the growing chill of evening. Outside, wind whistled through the canyon walls, creating an eerie soundtrack to her narrative. At first, he seemed like many other veterans trying to build new lives in the territories. He hauled supplies to mining camps, transported goods between settlements, even carried mail when the official routes were disrupted by weather or Indian troubles. Ayanna shifted restlessly in her chair, clearly eager to move beyond background information to actionable intelligence. But Caleb recognized that understanding their enemy's psychology might prove as important as knowing his physical location. "What changed?" he asked. Nasha's expression darkened. "Gold was discovered in the Judith Mountains 3 years ago. Not enough to create another California rush, but sufficient to attract hundreds of prospectors and the inevitable collection of merchants, gamblers, and criminals who follow such opportunities." The pipe smoke created shifting patterns in the lamplight as she continued her story, weaving together threads of history, economics, and human nature that painted a complex picture of territorial development. Wells saw opportunity in the chaos. His freight business expanded rapidly, but not just for legitimate cargo. He began moving weapons to anyone willing to pay his prices: settlers wanting protection, miners afraid of claim jumpers, even Apache warriors seeking modern firearms to defend their traditional hunting grounds. The implications were staggering. If Wells had been supplying weapons to multiple parties in the territorial conflicts, then he possessed both the means and the motive to orchestrate incidents that would increase demand for his services. "Gun running is profitable," Nasha observed, "but it requires a delicate balance. Too much peace and demand drops. Too much warfare and trade routes become impossible to maintain." Wells learned to manage the level of conflict like a rancher manages his cattle. Ayanna leaned forward, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "You think he staged the massacre to increase tensions?" "I think Garrett Wells discovered that controlling the news of conflict could be as profitable as supplying the weapons to fight it," Nasha replied carefully. When tensions between settlers and Apache began to decrease naturally, he found ways to reignite them. The pieces were falling into place with terrible clarity. A man with the resources, connections, and motivation to orchestrate false flag attacks would have little trouble recruiting accomplices willing to participate for the right price. The military background suggested by the uniform button indicated that Wells had access to veteran networks that might provide skilled personnel for such operations. "Where do we find him?" Caleb asked, ready to move from analysis to action. Nasha rose and walked to a wooden chest in the corner of the cabin, returning with a hand-drawn map that showed the region in remarkable detail. Rivers, mountain passes, settlements, and trails were all carefully marked in different colored inks that indicated their seasonal accessibility. "Wells maintains a headquarters at Maiden, a mining town in the Judith Mountains," she said, pointing to a location roughly 50 miles northeast of their current position. "But he also operates several way stations along his most profitable routes." She indicated 3 additional locations scattered across the map, each positioned at strategic points where multiple trails converged or where natural features created bottlenecks that facilitated control of commercial traffic. "The closest station is here at Crow Creek Crossing," she continued, tapping a spot about 20 miles from their current location. 2 buildings and a corral, usually staffed by 4 or 5 men who handle routine freight transfers and provide security for valuable cargo. Caleb studied the map carefully, noting the terrain features that would affect their approach to the station. The crossing sat in a valley surrounded by hills that could provide concealment for observation. But the same geography that offered tactical advantages for attackers would also limit escape routes if the confrontation went badly. "How current is your information?" he asked. Nasha's smile held no humor. 3 days ago, my grandson visited the station to trade beaver pelts for ammunition. Wells was there personally, along with 2 men who matched the descriptions Ayanna provided. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. Wells's presence at the station so soon after the massacre suggested either remarkable luck or careful planning on his part. More likely, he was using the remote location to lay low while initial outrage over the killings ran its course. "It could be a trap," Ayanna observed, voicing the concern that had been forming in Caleb's mind. "Everything about this situation could be a trap," he replied. "But we won't learn the truth by avoiding risks." As darkness settled over the hidden valley, they refined their plan with the methodical attention to detail that might mean the difference between justice and death. Nasha provided additional intelligence about the station's layout, the habits of its usual occupants, and the likely defensive positions they would establish if threatened. "Wells is cunning but not cowardly," she warned as they prepared to leave. "If you corner him, he will fight rather than surrender. The men with him are veterans like himself, skilled with weapons and experienced in violence." She disappeared into the darker recesses of the cabin, returning with items that transformed their modest arsenal into something more formidable. A second rifle, ammunition, field glasses, and supplies for an extended campaign were arranged on the table, like the contents of a military quartermaster's inventory. "Where did you get all this?" Caleb asked, impressed despite himself. "My late husband was a scout for the Army," Nasha replied matter-of-factly. "When he died, I kept his equipment. One never knows when such things might prove useful." They spent the evening cleaning weapons, checking equipment, and reviewing every aspect of their planned approach to Crow Creek Crossing. Ayanna demonstrated a familiarity with firearms that surprised Caleb, though he realized it should not have. Survival in Apache territory required proficiency with every available tool. As the fire burned down to glowing coals, Nasha prepared sleeping arrangements that maintained appropriate distances while maximizing defensive positions. Her casual expertise in matters of security and tactics spoke of a life spent navigating dangers that most people never imagined. "You should sleep," she advised as midnight approached. "Tomorrow we'll test everything you think you know about yourselves." Caleb lay on a bedroll near the cabin's single window, listening to the night sounds of the hidden valley while his mind wrestled with the complexities of their situation. They were about to confront armed criminals on their home ground, with minimal backup and no legal authority to justify their actions. Yet the alternative, allowing the murders to go unpunished while innocent Apache communities faced retaliation, was unacceptable. Sometimes justice required individuals to step beyond the boundaries of law and custom, accepting personal risk for the greater good. Dawn came gray and cold, with frost coating the grass outside the cabin and ice forming along the edges of the small lake. They ate a quick breakfast of leftover stew and cornbread while Nasha provided final briefings on the terrain. They would traverse. "Follow the stream until you reach the rock formation that looks like a sleeping bear," she instructed, sketching landmarks on a piece of bark with charcoal from the fireplace. "Then climb the ridge to your left and follow the game trail north for 3 miles. Her directions were precise and practical, the product of intimate knowledge acquired through years of travel in the region. She also provided contingency routes in case their primary approach proved compromised or dangerous. They departed the hidden valley as the sun climbed above the canyon walls, retracing their path through the narrow crack in the sandstone cliff. The outside world seemed harsher after the sheltered peace of Nasha's sanctuary, but Caleb found himself energized by the prospect of finally taking action against their quarry. Ranger waited patiently in the aspen grove where they had left him, apparently none the worse for his night of freedom. The horse seemed almost eager to resume traveling, as if he sensed the change in his rider's mood and purpose. They rode hard through the morning, following Nasha's directions across terrain that challenged both horse and riders. The trail climbed steadily toward a pass that offered spectacular views of the surrounding country, but also exposed them to observation from hostile parties. By noon, they had reached a position overlooking Crow Creek Crossing. The station lay exactly where Nasha had indicated, a cluster of weathered buildings beside a stream that provided water for travelers and their animals. Smoke rose from one chimney, and horses grazed in a fenced corral that suggested the presence of multiple inhabitants. Caleb used the field glasses to study the layout in detail. Two main buildings, a larger structure that probably served as both living quarters and office, and a smaller building that looked like a storage facility or stable. A third structure, little more than a shed, sat beside the creek where it could serve as a forge or workshop. "How many men do you count?" Ayanna asked, crouched beside him behind a screen of juniper bushes. "Hard to tell from this distance," he replied, continuing to scan the area. "At least 3, maybe more inside the buildings." Movement near the corral caught his attention. A man emerged from the main building, walking with the distinctive gait of someone compensating for an artificial limb. Even at a distance of several hundred yards, the identification was unmistakable. "There's our one-legged friend," Caleb observed, handing the glasses to Ayanna. She studied the figure for several minutes, memorizing details that might prove crucial in the confrontation ahead. When she lowered the glasses, her expression was grim but determined. "2 more men just came out of the storage building," she reported. "One matches the description of the yellow-haired leader, the other is shorter with dark hair." All 3 suspects were present at the station, exactly as Nasha had predicted. The convergence was too perfect to be accidental, suggesting that Wells was using the remote location as a safe house while the initial outrage over the massacre subsided. They spent the remainder of the afternoon observing the station's routines and defensive preparations. The men appeared relaxed but alert, following security protocols that spoke of military training and combat experience. Guards were posted at regular intervals, and weapons remained within easy reach even during routine activities. "They're professionals," Caleb noted as evening approached. "This won't be like surprising bandits or claim jumpers." "Good," Ayanna replied with quiet intensity. "I prefer enemies who are worth defeating." As darkness fell, they moved closer to the station, using natural cover and careful timing to avoid detection by the guards. The buildings were well lit from within, and the sound of conversation drifted across the still night air. The men inside seemed confident in their security, perhaps overconfident. Caleb and Ayanna positioned themselves behind a pile of supply crates about 50 yards from the main building. From there, they could observe the interior through uncurtained windows while remaining concealed in shadow. The scene inside looked like a celebration. 4 men sat around a wooden table playing cards and drinking whiskey, their voices loud with alcohol and apparent good humor. The yellow-haired leader held court at the head of the table, gesturing expansively as he recounted some story that drew laughter from his companions. "Garrett Wells," Ayanna whispered, confirming the identification. Caleb studied the man through the glasses, noting details that might prove important in the confrontation ahead. Wells was perhaps 40 years old, tall and lean with the weathered complexion of someone who spent most of his time outdoors. A revolver hung from his belt, and a rifle leaned against the wall within easy reach. The other men matched the descriptions provided by Ayanna and Nasha, the one-legged veteran. The shorter man with dark hair and a missing finger, and a 4th individual they had not previously identified. All were armed and appeared comfortable with their weapons. 4 against 2, Caleb observed. Not impossible odds, but not favorable either. "Numbers are less important than surprise and motivation," Ayanna replied. "They think they are safe. We know they are murderers." The psychological advantage was significant, but Caleb remained concerned about the tactical challenges they faced. A direct assault on the building would expose them to crossfire from multiple positions, while a siege would give the defenders time to organize and possibly summon reinforcements. As they watched, Wells rose from the table and walked to the window, peering out into the darkness as if sensing their presence. For a heart-stopping moment, Caleb thought they had been discovered. But after a few seconds, Wells returned to his seat and resumed the card game. "We need to get them outside," Caleb whispered. "Separate them if possible." Ayanna nodded, her mind already working on the tactical problem. "Fire," she said simply. It took him a moment to understand her meaning. A fire would force the men out of the building while creating confusion that could be exploited. But it would also destroy potential evidence and possibly harm innocent animals in the corral. The storage building, she clarified, pointing to the smaller structure. It sits downwind from the main building. Smoke will drive them out, but the fire won't spread unless we want it to. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Create a distraction that forced the quarry into the open, then confront them on more equal terms. The risks were substantial, but the alternative, attempting to storm a defended position, seemed even more dangerous. They worked their way around to the back of the storage building, moving with the patient stealth of predators approaching their prey. The structure was old and dry, filled with hay and other combustible materials that would ignite easily and burn quickly. Ayanna produced a small fire starter kit from her pouch flint, steel, and tinder prepared in the traditional Apache manner. Within minutes, she had coaxed flames to life in a pile of dry grass near the building's rear wall. The fire spread with frightening speed, fed by decades of accumulated dust and debris. Within minutes, smoke was pouring from cracks in the walls, and tongues of flame were visible through gaps in the roof. Shouts erupted from the main building as the men inside discovered the blaze. They burst through the front door in various states of readiness, some carrying weapons while others struggled to pull on boots and coats. "The whole place is going up," Wells shouted, his voice carrying clearly across the compound. "Get the horses before they panic." The four men split up to deal with the emergency, exactly as Caleb and Ayanna had hoped. Two headed for the corral to calm the frightened animals, while Wells and the dark-haired man grabbed buckets and ran toward the creek for water. It was the moment they had been waiting for, their enemies separated and distracted, focused on fighting the fire rather than watching for threats. Caleb rose from concealment with his rifle ready, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "Garrett, Wells, you're under arrest for the murder of innocent travelers." The effect was electric. All four men froze momentarily, their minds struggling to process the unexpected challenge. Then training and instinct took over, and they scattered like startled birds. Wells dove behind a water trough, his revolver appearing in his hand with practiced speed. The one-legged man took cover behind the corral fence, using it as a rest for his rifle. The other two disappeared into the shadows between buildings, their positions unknown but undoubtedly dangerous. "Give yourselves up," Caleb shouted, though he expected no such surrender. "We know what you did to that family." Wells's reply came in the form of a gunshot that splintered the crate beside Caleb's head. The battle was joined, and there would be no negotiation or compromise. Ayanna had vanished into the darkness, moving with the silent efficiency of a hunter born to such work. Caleb could not see her, but he trusted that she was positioning herself to maximum advantage while he drew the defenders' attention. More gunshots echoed across the compound as the four men tried to establish firing positions that would allow them to eliminate the threat to their sanctuary. The burning storage building cast dancing shadows that made accurate shooting nearly impossible, but it also provided concealment for attackers and defenders alike. Caleb worked his way closer to the main building, using darkness and smoke as cover while keeping track of his enemies' locations through muzzle flashes and shouted commands. The firefight had evolved into a deadly game of cat and mouse, with victory likely to go to whoever made the first significant mistake. A scream from near the corral announced that Ayanna had made contact with one of their adversaries. The sound was followed by thrashing and cursing, then an ominous silence that suggested the outcome of that particular encounter. "Jake's down," someone shouted from the shadows. "The Indian got Jake." 3 enemies remained, but now they knew they faced at least 2 attackers, and their confidence was beginning to crack. Wells continued firing from behind his water trough, but his shots were increasingly wild as panic began to override training. Caleb seized the initiative, moving rapidly from position to position while laying down suppressive fire that kept the defenders' heads down. His goal was not necessarily to hit his targets, but to prevent them from organizing an effective counterattack. The strategy worked. The one-legged man broke cover and limped rapidly toward the main building, seeking better protection than the corral fence provided. It was exactly the kind of panicked movement that Caleb had been hoping to provoke. He led the running figure by several feet and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against his shoulder, and the man went down hard, his artificial leg clattering across the ground as he fell. "Two down," he called to Ayanna, wherever she might be concealed. Wells's response was a fusillade of shots that forced Caleb to dive for cover behind a pile of firewood. Splinters flew as bullets chewed into the logs, some coming close enough that he could feel their passage through the air. But the rapid fire also revealed Wells's position with perfect clarity. Caleb rolled to his left, came up on one knee, and put 2 rounds through the water trough where his enemy was hiding. The first shot punched through the metal with a shower of sparks. The second was rewarded with a cry of pain and the sound of someone falling heavily to the ground. Silence settled over the compound, broken only by the crackling of the dying fire and the restless movement of horses in the corral. Caleb remained in position, scanning the area for signs of the fourth man who had disappeared into the shadows. "Ayanna?" he called softly. "Here," came her voice from somewhere near the creek. "One more hiding behind the forge." The last enemy had chosen his position well. The stone building provided excellent protection, and its location gave him clear fields of fire toward both the main compound and the approaches from the surrounding hills. But patience was a virtue that Ayanna possessed in abundance. She had grown up hunting game that survived by being more cautious than their predators, learning to wait for the perfect moment when prey would reveal itself through movement or impatience. The moment came when the hidden man tried to relocate to a position with better visibility. Ayanna's rifle spoke once, and the threat was eliminated with professional efficiency. "It's over," she announced, emerging from concealment with her weapon ready but no longer needed. Caleb rose and walked toward the scattered bodies, checking each one to ensure that the threat had been completely neutralized. Wells was still breathing but unconscious, blood seeping from a shoulder wound that looked painful but not fatal. The others had not been as fortunate. "This one will live to stand trial," he observed, kneeling beside the wounded leader. "If we can get him to a town with a proper jail," Ayanna replied, already thinking ahead to the practical challenges that lay ahead. They bound Wells's wound and secured him with ropes that would prevent escape but allow survival during the journey to justice. The evidence they recovered from his belongings would be sufficient to prove his guilt in any reasonable court of law. As dawn broke over Crow Creek Crossing, Caleb and Ayanna prepared for the long ride to the nearest settlement with proper legal authority. Behind them, smoke still rose from the ruins of the storage building, a funeral pyre for the dreams of men who had chosen profit over principle. The murdered family would finally have justice, and the Apache communities would be spared the war that Wells had tried to orchestrate. It was not a perfect ending. Too many people had died, and too much damage had been done, but it was the best outcome that circumstances allowed. They rode south through the morning light, their prisoner secured across the back of his own horse. The mountains rose around them like cathedral spires, eternal and unchanging despite the small human dramas that played out in their shadows. Behind them lay violence and death. Ahead lay the possibility of peace, purchased with blood and courage by 2 unlikely allies who had learned that justice sometimes required individuals to act when institutions failed. The hunt was over, but their partnership had only just begun.